Hey, I'm Kat, mom of 3 and founder of Ritual, the company setting a new standard in the supplement industry. When I was pregnant, I remember staring at my prenatal vitamins and thinking, what's in this stuff? All I found were vitamins high in heavy metals and lacking in the very essential nutrients we need. So we scoured the world for the best quality ingredients, backed by clinical studies, third-party tested, and Ritual's Essential Prenatal was born. Join our family of skeptics with 40% off your first month when you visit ritual.com/podcast.
This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, of course, we are all celebrating Black History Month. And at Make It Plain, we've chose to celebrate it partially by acknowledging a group of institutions that have the very name history in their names. The HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And of course, they're even more so in the focus these days because we have someone in the White House for the first time who is an HBCU graduate. You all have heard me talk about my relationship to HBCUs, literally born on the campus of one and raised on the campus of another, and then attending 2 of them myself. These are our sacred institutions. I'm excited about our guest today and thankful for him because there can't be too much ever published about HBCU history. There ought to be much more. And he's even, you can't judge a book by its cover, but you can definitely judge his by its title. And we're thankful for that. So to kick off this first Friday, and we'll be having these conversations every Friday. I want to thank our producer, Brittany Temple, for shepherding and developing this idea. And again, an example of just how much more interest there is in HBCUs these days because of Kamala Harris. We want to welcome, again, the title of this book is a great title, Shelter in a Time of Storm, How Black Colleges Fostered Generations of Leadership and Activism. Indeed, we're happy to have with us Associate Professor of History at Clayton State University, Dr. Jelani M. Favors joins Make It Plain for Black History Month. Hey, brother, how are you, man?
I'm doing great, man. Great to be with you, and thanks for the invitation to have this conversation.
It's an honor to have you. I just want to acknowledge some of Dr. Favors, you got your PhD in history and an MA in African American Studies from the Ohio State University. Where'd you go undergrad, brother?
North Carolina A&T State University.
And HBCU. Aggie Pride. Indeed. Also, it's interesting. History is closer than we think. I noticed too, folks, that at one time he was had a Mellon HBCU fellowship at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. My mother was an administrative employee at Fisk University for over 30 years while I was raised, and was very close to Dr. Franklin. So, and you see that stuff and you think about it, wow, these are people who we actually knew and walked the earth. And, we think about HBCUs in the relative context, 150 years is not a very long time in our history. So again, we're thankful for you writing this. I want to set the tone even from the title. Shelter in a Time of Storm. Help our audience understand what the storm was that was going on that prompted even a discussion about building institutions for higher learning for our people.
Absolutely. Again, thanks for having me. I'm a preacher's kid from the South, man. And, when I was in grad school and trying to work my way through the intellectual ideas of this project and a title for the project, I leaned on an old gospel song, right? Shelter in a Time of Storm. And that's exactly, as you said, this is exactly what these institutions have been, going back to 1837 with the founding of the Institute for Colored Youth, on up into the antebellum era, the 1850s, and the founding of Wilberforce and Lincoln. these were institutions that, as racial violence exploded on the scene in American life, as African Americans, civil and human rights were being stripped from them, space was at a premium. Where could they go to be edified? Where could they go to get direction? Where could they go to get a counter message that they were not inferior, that they were not Sambos, that they were not coons, and HBCUs became that type of space. So, that's one of the things and one of the reasons why I wanted to start that story off with Cheyney State University, also known as the Institute for Colored Youth, is that so many folks think that the North was some sort of paradise, that, Black folks escaped from slavery and, made their way to the North, and, the North was some sort of, a redeeming space for Black people. But there were race riots in the streets of Philadelphia. There were race riots in the streets of New York. Black folks were fighting to remain free. So even in the North, we needed these shelters, right? These spaces where again, Black youth could be empowered and, more importantly, be equipped with a vision to try to deconstruct white supremacy where they found it.
And so Cheyney was the very first one, correct?
Well, that's an ongoing debate with between Cheyney and Lincoln and Wilberforce. Cheyney, the Institute for Colored Youth, as it was founded, was founded in 1837. Lincoln prides himself on the fact that they are the first degree-granting institution that granted degrees to Black folks, and it was founded in 1856, I believe. And then you have Wilberforce that says, "Hold the phone. We're the first school that was actually founded by Black people because it was founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church." Mm-hmm. Lincoln, for years, was run by white folks. Right. From the board of trustees down to the educators and the faculty members. So they constantly go back and forth on who's the real first HBCU. But for the purposes of the study, I knew that I wanted to open up in 1837 by telling the story of people like Ebenezer Bassett and Octavius Catto and Fannie Jackson Coppin, because they epitomize the best of what HBCUs were going to stand for, not just in 1837, but moving forward for years to come.
Well, talk to us about some of those personalities and the three of them, and what they did, and how they got the temerity to even say we got to have our own institutions.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I think what it represents is that from the very beginning there was a blueprint, right, of what Black education could and should be. Right. This wasn't going to be the same space as Yale and Harvard and William and Mary and a number of the other early institutions that were in existence. This was going to be a space that was deeply and directly connected to the freedom dreams of Black people. And it was going to not just, again, teach them Greek and Latin and history and science. It was going to teach them that they were to be cultural change agents. They were to be political change agents for their community. So when someone like Ebenezer Bassett arrives on the scene, there's a great story I tell in the opening of that first chapter, where and other historians have documented this as well. But when John Brown, right, the white abolitionist, is captured, he has written in his pocket a list of people and places that kind of like safe houses, places where he can go and people he can lean on if indeed this plan went awry. And of course, it did go awry. And one of the names on that list was Ebenezer Bassett, who was the principal and the head of the Institute for Colored Youth. So that lets you know immediately that people understood that these Black colleges, these Black institutions of higher learning, as I said before, were deeply and directly connected to the freedom dreams of Black people, and they were indeed serving as a shelter in a time of storm. Black folks knew that. John Brown himself knew that. And leaned on that. But from Ebenezer Bassett, you get a whole cast of characters emerging here. Jacob White Jr., Octavius Catto, again, Fannie Jackson Coppin, who comes from Oberlin and serves as the next principal of that institution after Ebenezer Bassett. These are folks who are radicals. These are folks who are activists. Jacob White and Octavius Catto helped to write petitions that were presented before Congress arguing for the 14th and 15th Amendments. So again, Black folks were using these educational spaces to argue for citizenship, to argue for suffrage for African-American men. again, they are the epitome, and they are the one of the perfect illustrations of how Black institutions were connected to the idea of deconstructing white supremacy and forming a more better and more tolerant society.
Octavius Cattle, tell us his story as well, if you would. He was murdered.
He was murdered, and you know, as a graduate student, not even as a graduate student, when I finished my PhD, and my academic advisor and mentor at Ohio State was Dr. Hassan Jeffries, and it was Dr. Jeffries who encouraged me to, and Dr. Jeffries, by the way, is author of Bloody Lowndes, which talks about the Black Power movement in Lowndes County, Alabama, a brilliant historian and again, my mentor. But it was Dr. Jeffries who encouraged me to expand the story, to try to tell not just the story of two institutions, which is what I had done for my dissertation, but to try to hit the home run and tell this broader story of what Black colleges have represented. And so immediately the question became, well, where does the story begin? What institutions do I begin to include in that? And when I ran across and read the story of Octavius Cattle, I knew from the start that this is where the book begins. Right? Because again, it illustrates everything that these institutions stood for. Octavius Cattle is a young student at the Institute for Colored Youth. He is mentored and shaped by people like Ebenezer Bassett. And he graduates and he becomes a professor himself at the institution. But again, what's the spirit of that institution? What is that institution cultivating amongst the students? As a student, he had been taught to, again, hitch his future to the freedom dreams of Black folk. And now as a professor, he was molding his own students in that same type of tradition. And so again, he's writing petitions to the Congress about, again, why it's necessary to have a 14th and a 15th Amendment protecting the humanity and civil rights of Black folks, as well as, again, giving African-American men the right to vote. But he's a Renaissance man. This guy was a writer. He was a leader within the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, which is one of the earlier civil rights organizations in the North. He was a standout second baseman for a Philadelphia Black baseball team. And so he was an incredible figure. And I mentioned this in the book, and as I've said before, other historians have documented this. But when he's assassinated by a white supremacist, his funeral is the second largest funeral that came through the city of Philadelphia behind Abraham Lincoln. In terms of the procession, in terms of the people who turned out, the community loved this man and revered this man. And the students openly weep for Octavius Cattle being cut down by the bullet of a white supremacist assassin. So he has a very important legacy and a long shadow in the early civil rights movement in Philadelphia, and certainly really epitomizes what the Institute for Colored Youth and what Cheyney State University would stand for years to come.
So even at that early time, there was education for liberation going on. It wasn't just education for education's sake. I mean, there was a level of wokeness and consciousness taking place, correct?
Without question. And, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. The Institute for Colored Youth was founded in 1837. But even prior to that, you had these African free schools, which often existed in cities like New York, and there was even an emerging one in Philadelphia. So again, the idea of Black folks looking at education as sort of a figurative messiah, something that they could use to uplift themselves in society and to equip them to be successful in society, was, again, directly linked to the idea of also equipping our students with the ability to articulate on behalf of the Black masses, right? To articulate, I mean, remember, you know, most Black folks were illiterate. Most white folks were illiterate in the 19th and 20th century. So literacy was not something which was commonplace in America for a number of years. And so HBCUs, Black colleges, from their inception, knew that this simply wasn't about literacy in the sense that we're going to, again, provide them training as future mathematicians and scientists and lawyers, right? But also that we're going to provide them with the type of skill set and the ability to articulate on behalf of Black people. And again, this is why the ICY, the Institute for Colored Youth, is such an important example of how this unfolds. Again, you see young students being trained in this way. You also see something that I talk about throughout the book, is that these spaces open themselves up to endless caravan of Black leaders and Black activists who made their way into these institutions, who gave guest speeches. You had Frederick Douglass coming to speak at the Institute for Colored Youth. You had Henry Highland Garnett coming to speak at the Institute for Colored Youth. That type of interaction mattered in producing the type of students that would emerge from these institutions. So, one of the concepts, and I'm assuming perhaps we'll get into this later on, but I use the terminology of communitas, which is a phrase which I borrow from a cultural anthropologist by the name of Victor Turner. But the reason why I use that, one of my colleagues had read an earlier draft, and he was the one who really introduced me to Victor Turner, saying, you should read some cultural anthropology and think about different ways to describe space. Because what is very clear, Mark, is that HBCUs, as I said before, the Institute for Colored Youth was not the same type of space as a Harvard or a Yale. And by that, I don't simply mean in terms of the resources and the type of elite nature that we often attach to those institutions. But as one institution, or as PWIs, we're promoting white supremacy, right? We're promoting the idea of teaching that Reconstruction was a horrible mistake. There is a counter message that is going on within the spaces of HBCUs. And again, those messages, they empowered and pushed Black youth to deconstruct white supremacy, to see themselves as weapons against Jim Crow, even as those things were really beginning to crystallize in the 19th and early 20th century.
You had first earlier mentioned about, they were HBCUs that were founded by African Americans, but we also know there were whites who founded some of these schools and ran them. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm right about, I mentioned Fisk. Some of them name it Howard. What was going on there? Were those founded by these whites, missionary or otherwise? Were they as radicalized, or to use the term you introduced, communitized, as the Institute for Colored Youth started out being?
Yeah, without question. And, again, this becomes one of the issues that I deal with, in the book. And this is where the concept of communitas becomes so important, is that you have a carving out of a space, right? And as you mentioned, there are a number of white philanthropists who should get the credit for carving out that space. Again, Black folks are emerging out of slavery, where they have been enslaved for the last 200 years and just lack the material resources to build many of these institutions. So it took a number of white benefactors to really carve out the space to help build the buildings. But once those spaces are erected, and this is where the next part of my theorizing comes forward in the book, I talk about this idea of a second curriculum. Right? It's an energy, it's a pedagogy that flows within these institutions. And it's not always distributed and administered simply by the faculty. So in a situation like Lincoln, right, or a situation like some of these earlier on, the AMA schools, the American Missionary Association, which founded Fisk, which founded Talladega, which founded Tougaloo and Morehouse, right? These Baptist institutions that emerged. Yes, they are constructed by white folks. In some cases, they're even run by white folks. But Black folks have a certain vision for what they want for themselves, right? And how they can see their education, again, being used and even weaponized against white supremacy. And so the second curriculum begins to flow through these institutions, right? And so when I talk about the second curriculum, it's really comprised of I argue, three things: race consciousness, cultural nationalism, and idealism, right? And again, this is something I talk about in the introduction of the book, but James Weldon Johnson talks about being a student at Morehouse in the early 20th century. And he said, look, everything that we talked about, everything that we dealt with, it's centered around race, right? And race permeated through the institution. It was the subject of essays and debates and conversations in the dorms and across what Black folks would call the yard, right? Being on the yard. And so, again, it shows a sort of race-centered space being crafted and developed where, again, even though some of these institutions are run by white folks and controlled by white folks, the issue that is at the foremost in the minds of young Black folks is how can we deconstruct this system, which has been weaponized against us. Again, Jim Crow society, white supremacy, racial violence is exploding throughout the early 20th century. And Black folks understand that this space is going to be critical in training. HBCUs are founded really to train two professions, ministers and teachers. Right? And so the early ministers are coming out of these institutions. The early teachers, right, are coming out of these institutions. And if indeed they had embraced the idea that they were inferior, if they had embraced the idea that they were somehow not mentally equipped to be successful in society, then, we would have had generations of young Black folks who were really a disservice to Black America. But that's not what we had. We have generations of young Black folks emerging from HBCUs who were legendary activists, outspoken in their fields, and found ways to advance the freedom dreams of Black folks for a number of generations.
You have a chapter entitled Black and Tan Academia. What do you mean by that?
So the Black and Tan conventions were conventions that emerged in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, in the Deep South, where in the midst of Reconstruction, you have Black folks, Black men in particular, who are being elected into political positions for the very first time. And in many cases, they are shouldering the load now, standing side by side, a number of white colleagues, white peers. The overwhelming majority of those in the South, of course, were racist Southern Democrats, which of course was the ruling party of the South at the time. But you also had a number of white Republicans, right? And so that terminology emerged as sort of a derisive slur, right? People will often refer to the Black and Tan conventions as Black folks and white people who are really, friends to Black folks coming and developing these relationships in an effort to try to push forward a more progressive agenda in the Deep South during the Reconstruction era. So Black and Tan was, again, originally intended to be a slur against those type of relationships being formed. But again, without these Black and Tan conventions, we don't get a Southern university, right, which was founded literally by many of these Black politicians who developed these convenient relationships with a number of white political activists who also believe that, hey, Black folks need schools, right? and that, we need to construct these type of spaces. So yeah, when I say Black and Tan academia, again, I'm talking about the relationships that created that space. Again, Tougaloo is an example of that. Where again you have the AMA, which is an organization which is run mostly by white folks, creating Fisk, creating Talladega, creating Tougaloo. But you also have within that space Black folks, as I said earlier, they have a vision of freedom all on their own, and they know exactly how they want to pursue this, how they can pursue it in the safest way, because clearly Mississippi was the belly of the beast and one of the most violent states in the Union. In terms of racial violence and white terrorism. And they understood that it was going to take a clandestine approach. It was going to take a subtle approach if indeed they want to survive and push their efforts forward.
Another chapter, Race Women, and you talk about new Negro politics and somewhat of how things became radicalized even at Bennett College. That's very interesting. Talk to us about that as well and the role that women were playing at this time.
One of my favorite chapters, Mark. I took a fellowship in 2013 at Duke University. It was, as you mentioned, the Humanities Writ Large Fellowship. Prior to that, I had been a Mellon Fellow in 2009, but Duke invited me back to put the finishing touches on his book in 2013. And originally, that chapter was supposed to be on Howard University. So I was going to write a chapter on Howard University. That was the last chapter that had not yet been fully written. And so I came to Duke with full intentions of beginning my research into Howard. And one of my colleagues, who was also a fellow that year, Yolanda was teaching at Bennett at the time, and she and I were having lunch, and she said to me, everybody always talks about Howard. Nobody ever talks about Bennett. Right? And somebody needs to tell Bennett's story. And I looked at it and I said, you know what? You're right. And this is a golden opportunity for me to tell the story of what was going on at Bennett College in the early 20th century and to fill in that gap. But also, as you mentioned, to dedicate an entire chapter to talking about how Black women were being educated during this era, and how they too were not just two, but they were probably the most important weapons against white supremacy during this era. And so that chapter took off, and I'm so glad that I did it. It's one of my favorite chapters. For a lot of folks who've read the book, many of them comment that it's one of their favorite chapters as well. David Dallas Jones, Bennett becomes a single-sex institution in 1926. They hire as their president a man by the name of David Dallas Jones, who became the president there, and he was a race man, as so many former Black. He was also a Morehouse man, but again, that's a legacy and a testament to the type of educational leaders that were being produced. These were race men and race women who then went on to lead race men and race women and help cultivate race men and race women. So when David Dallas Jones arrives in Greensboro in 1926, one, there are a couple of things working in his favor. Greensboro is slightly progressive. And I do mean slightly. It still was in the Jim Crow South, but he used that space to his advantage to help mold and to shape generations of young Black women who saw themselves again as weapons against white supremacy. And he pulled no punches. Right? He would openly say that this is what we're doing. This is what our job should be as educators, creating women and creating young men like the ones that we're creating at Bennett College. And out of this, you see a litany of young Black women activists. Again, many of them went on to become educators themselves. Many of them went on to teach themselves. And again, in that capacity, they're molding and shaping the next generation of young Black folks. But again, when you think about the power of HBCUs, right? Again, Dr. David Dallas Jones is good friends with Mary McLeod Bethune. Right? It matters when someone like Mary McLeod Bethune can come through your institution, your campus, and begin to also shape and mold. Right? Ella Baker is invited to come address and to come speak to students at Bennett College. Not only that, but David Dallas Jones actually offers her a job. Right? David Dallas Jones was so impressed with her fervor and her passion for civil rights and activism. He says, "Hey, we need you here at Bennett." Again, these are the type of spaces that Bennett would be and HBCUs would be. Again, shelters in a time of storm where we can see these type of folks circulating and touching the young Black masses, and in doing so, giving them a vision to run with. And again, that's the legacy of Bennett. And so again, that era of the new Negro from the 1920s and 30s into the 1940s, these were some of the most radicalized periods on HBCU campuses, especially feeding into that World War II era where really radicalism and activism really begins to explode on college campuses, HBCUs that is, throughout the Deep South.
So this is something that has always interested me, and you're the history professor, so maybe you can help and kind of reconcile this. At what point in the chronology of our HBCU history does the debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington become most prevalent, if at all? Because, the snapshot always says, well, Du Bois was arguing for a certain type of education, Booker T was arguing for another. But just how significant was that, and what impact did it have on the development and the growth of our HBCUs?
So in terms of chronology, we're talking late 19th and early 20th century. I'll be honest with you, Mark. I often think that argument is overplayed. We gravitate towards and celebrate what a number of past historians often refer to as great man history, right? We want to focus on the great men of society who have shaped our society. And again, this is by no means trying to diminish the legacy of Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who were titans in the field in the narrative of African American history. But what both of these men were doing, essentially, were carving out space, right? Space that they thought would be most beneficial to advancing the freedom dreams of Black folks. Again, for Booker T. Washington, he's tasked to go into Tuskegee. And I don't know if too many of your listeners have ever been to Tuskegee, but if you've ever been to Tuskegee, Alabama, it is in the middle of nowhere, right? So, get in a time machine with me and go back to the late 19th century and envision someone like Booker T. Washington, who was a graduate of Hampton Institute, being tasked to go down into the hinterlands of Alabama and to carve out a space where young Black folks could be educated. He understood and knew that, we can't make an overt message attacking white supremacy because Black life was inconsequential to white folks in the state of Alabama. Black folks were being lynched and terrorized and brutalized. And so, again, he very conveniently, and some would argue even pragmatically, began to say, look, you know what I'm going to try to do is cultivate a relationship, a friendship with white folks in order to secure the dollars that will carve and create this space. And in doing so, provide room for young Black folks to be educated. Now, again, he's criticized, and I would say rightfully so, in being extremely gracious toward his white benefactors. Of course, I live in Atlanta, and it's in Piedmont Park, a very popular park in Atlanta, where Booker T. Washington gives his very famous speech, his exposition speech, where he literally stands before a crowd of white folks and say, look, we can be as one as a hand, but as separate as the fingers. And again, a lot of people say, hey, you are embracing and celebrating segregation. Not Booker T. Washington, but Du Bois would be one of his largest critics. But I think also what he's doing is that, again, he's carving out space, right? And I talk about this in the chapter on Tougaloo. Booker T. Washington also was a large proponent of creating all Black towns, right? Mound Bayou in Mississippi is supported through people like Booker T. Washington, who says, yes, this is exactly what we need. Carve out our space. And I guess a way that we could look at that in 2021 is that Booker T. Washington is literally saying, look, we need to get away from these white folks. They're crazy, right? They're engaging in terrorism against our people, right? Racial violence is exploding, right? Don't mess with these white folks. Let's carve out our own space. And again, the legacy of that is that people like Marcus Garvey would adhere to those messages. People like the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad would adhere to those messages. They embrace many of the teachings of what Booker T. Washington was arguing. And so in my book, again, I talk about the second curriculum. This falls under the concepts of cultural nationalism. Right? The Black folks understood the importance of building space and supporting Black institutions, supporting Black organizations, supporting Black businesses. These are all the type of things that people like Booker T. Washington argued for. Now, again, conversely, Du Bois is saying, hey, let's carve out space, but we need as he very popularly argue, we need a talented 10th, right? And a lot of folks look at that as elitism. Right. But he's saying that, hey, everybody can't be, carpenters and brick masons and domestics and all these other professions that are being promoted at a place like Tuskegee. We need some folks who, again, can articulate and fight for Black rights in the halls of political power within America. We need lawyers and activists and writers and thinkers, right? Philosophers. Young philosophers emerging from these institutions. So yes, Washington and Du Bois are kind of going back and forth here, but it's really about space. There's a survey that I came across from a parent in Mississippi. I can't remember the institute that actually commissioned this survey, but they did a survey of Black parents asking them what type of education they would prefer. Right? Do you want vocational training, right, the Booker T. Washington method, or do you want the talented 10th, right? The idea of a more Victorian liberal arts training promoted by people like Du Bois. And one of the parents responded and said, look, you know what? I don't care what kind of education my son and daughter gets. I just don't want them to be a sharecropper like me, right? So I want them to have opportunity to carve out a different path for themselves. And I think that's the most important legacy of those two men, carving out space so the Black folks can make some decisions that freed them from the peonage and from the bondage that they experienced in the Deep South.
Very, very important. Folks, this book is great, and I encourage you to read it. And thank you for that. If you don't mind, I want to borrow that as we talk about that going forward. What would you call it? The great man view?
A great man theory.
Great man theory, yeah. Because you're right. We do that too much.
We do.
So,
I mean, Mark, we love messianic figures.
Yeah.
We love the idea of Dr. King riding in on a white horse and saving folks. But what we miss are the grassroots activists, the yeomen, the laborers who really push this movement forward. And again, that doesn't diminish someone like a Booker T. Washington or Du Bois or someone like a Dr. King or even, someone like a Rosa Parks. But again, we love these messianic figures, but we miss the larger picture of the fact that Black folks were struggling and striving and fighting to gain their freedom. And there are a number of no-name folks, right, who we've never heard of, who played critical roles in shaping the future of Black America. And I think that's one of the things that I really want to try to do with the book is to bring some of these folks you've never heard of. Again, educators, teachers, faculty members of HBCUs who were just as important to advancing the freedom dreams of Black folks as some of these great legendary figures that we often venerate and celebrate.
And I appreciate that. Not only that, though, but, sometimes we make messianic even the institutions themselves. Like we started out talking about Howard. One of the things I appreciate about your book, I mean, Howard's known as the Mecca, so to speak. You lift up Cheney and Tougaloo and Bennett, Alabama State, Jackson State, Southern, and your alma mater, A&T, because there's a lot of history there, transformative history that people don't know. People know about the great Howard University protests, but there was these kind of things that were going on in other cities and states and other HBCUs as well. So before we go, give us your thoughts about the significance of having an HBCU alum a heartbeat away from the presidency and what that says about the cumulative journey of our HBCU institutions and what they've imparted to us and what has been produced from them.
Well, I mean, I think you said it. It's a cumulative journey, right? And I think that Vice President Kamala Harris would echo the same sentiment, is that you see her success, but what you don't see is the legacy of folks who made that possible, right? And these institutions are a part of that journey, and not just in creating a Kamala Harris, but as I argue, Mark, and I've said this in a couple of other interviews and talks that I've given now on HBCUs, the most important contribution. We celebrate the cultural pageantry of Black colleges. We love to talk about the Black college bands and the step shows and the energy, right? This is an era where we love to talk about Black boy joy and Black excellence. And yes, these institutions have become spaces where all of that can run free. And that's critically important, right? But the most important contributions that these institutions have made in their long histories have been reshaping and shaping the social and political contours of America. There would be no civil rights movement, either the early or the modern civil rights movement, had it not been for Black colleges. And again, this is not diminishing the legacy of the Black church and other institutions and organizations who have played critical roles in producing leaders. But HBCUs are one of the cornerstones of the Black freedom movement in America. And we don't get a Kamala Harris if we don't have a Diane Nash, right? We don't get a Kamala Harris if we don't have an Ella Baker. We don't get a Kamala Harris if we don't have a Jesse Jackson, right? Who runs his campaign in the 1980s, who's a graduate of North Carolina A&T State University. We don't get a Kamala Harris if we don't have a John Lewis. I love that story that Barack Obama tells about writing in the program when he was inaugurated, writing in John Lewis's program, inauguration program, thank you, right? I'm paraphrasing here, but again, there would be no me without you, right? And so again, when you look at the legacy of institutions like Fisk, institutions like North Carolina A&T, institutions like Howard University and Florida A&M, and as you said before, some of the lesser known institutions, Alabama State, Alcorn, these are institutions which paved that path for us to have a Kamala Harris. And it never was simply about producing Black leaders and Black excellence who would go on and succumb to the trappings of hyper-capitalism and embrace, materialism and elitism. But it was always about young Black leaders understanding that they have a connection and a responsibility to the masses of Black people. Right? Ella Baker talks about this, and Barbara Ransby's great biography on Ella Baker really kind of lays out the type of education that a woman like Ella Baker received at Shaw University. And she talks about the fact that, hey, when I was at Shaw, it was always about service. It was always about maintaining this connection to the masses. Howard Thurman talks about that in his experiences as a young student. And then we're talking about the great theologian and philosopher Howard Thurman, who talks about when he was a student in Morehouse, those same type of messages were embedded within him. So it was always about this connection with the masses and moving Black folks collectively, not just the Black elite, not just the lettered, not just those Black folks who were alumni of these institutions, not just moving them forward, but moving the Black masses. And so my hope for Vice President Kamala Harris moving forward, and I have full faith and trust that she will continue that legacy and understand that she is not an island unto herself, that she's a product of an institution like Howard University. She's a product of organizations like Alpha Kappa Alpha, that have always been, as I said before, deeply connected with the freedom dreams of Black folks, and we're proud of her. And again, she represents the best of what HBCUs can and should be doing. And I hope that moving forward, we'll see more Kamala Harris's, we'll see more Stacey Abrams, we'll see more Raphael Warnocks. Again, all products of HBCUs, all now standing on the cusp of what we can only hope is a new day politically within this country.
And still, HBCUs as relevant, as necessary as they've always been for that to happen. I'm probably older than you. I am 54. And when I graduated from high school in 85, especially growing up like I did in Nashville, we all grew up at Fisk and Tennessee State. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where we lived.
Right.
So some of us were like, well, we don't have to go to HBCU. And there was a generation of us that felt like our parents went to HBCUs. We can go to some of the big white universities. All right. But I strongly feel, that wasn't the best thing for all of us. And I think even now more than ever before, Dr. Favors, this generation coming along, my son's 18. And I've been saying it to parents. We need to get our kids back in these HBCUs. Right. Because what our parents did and grandparents, their experience, as critical as that was, and they gave us a lot of that knowledge, our separation, some of us, from HBCUs, necessitates our kids and our grandkids going back. All right. And getting rerouted. And I mean, we're seeing what's happening in a lot of these white universities, PWIs, and the racism that still exists there. And let's face it, most of those who are successful in the professional world and academic world and the legal world and the PhD world still are produced primarily by HBCUs. So folks, let us not forsake our HBCUs. And I frankly believe that if you have any doubt about that, this book will wake you up and inspire you to realize the importance. And there's nothing like an HBCU experience. When my son was a baseball recruit, and, the question was, and like a lot of these college athletes, be sure you go to a school. The school he finally ended up at that recruited him, the coach asked this, he would ask kids, be sure you go to a school whose homecoming you would want to go back to every year.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, and can't do that everywhere. Now, a whole lot of folks go to these other schools. Now, you ain't going to that homecoming, right. but you want to go to a school where you can go back to homecoming. So we're coming home. Folks, look, we really want to encourage you to check this book out, Shelter in a Time of Storm, How Black Colleges Fostered Generations of Leadership and Activism. What's the next project you're working on, my brother?
So the next project, I'm moving away from the education field, and I'm looking at an 1898 lynching case of Frazier Baker, who was a Black postmaster in Lake City, South Carolina, who, along with his 1-year-old daughter, I repeat, his 1-year-old daughter, were lynched in 1898. And it sparked a federal trial, actually, because he was a Black postmaster. So the federal government gets involved. There's a massive trial that comes out of this. it really kind of becomes a catalyst for the early civil rights movement. But I'm writing a book on that, but I'm also looking at the legacy of whiteness and how whiteness played a role. Because again, why is this man lynched? Right? This man is lynched because he represented Black excellence. He represented the idea of Black uplift, all of which a number of whites in 1898 felt was a threat to the currency of whiteness itself, and to the power of whiteness itself. And I think that there's a lesson in that, there's a historical lesson in that, but I also think there's a contemporary lesson in that too, Mark.
Absolutely, that is a lesson. We look forward to that too, my brother. Thank you for this, folks. Again, check it out, Shelter in a Time of Storm, How Black Colleges Foster Generations of Leadership and Activism. Again, we'll be focusing on this subject of HBCUs throughout Black History Month. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Jelani M. Favors. And once again, folks, we wish you all a happy Black History Month.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Take care.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, subscribe, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.
Nice buns, soft, fluffy, and ultra-low net carbs. Discover Hero Bread, the delicious ultra-low net carb bread with incredible taste and texture. Hero Bread has 0 grams of sugar and is under 100 calories per serving. Plus, high in fiber with 5 to 10 grams of protein per serving. Order from hero.co now and get 10% off your first purchase with promo code AH10. That's 10% off with code AH10. HERO.co.